6 black choir girls vanished after Easter Sunday in 1961, but on that bright Alabama morning, their voices rang pure and clear through Mount Olive Baptist Church as if they would sing forever. Ruby Mae Williams adjusted her white gloves one last time and glanced at the other girls in the mirror propped against the church basement wall, their faces glowing with nervous excitement. "You'll sound like angels when you hit that high note," Mrs. Pearl Jenkins called from the old upright piano, her fingers still dancing across yellowed keys. The church organist had been coaching them since February, preparing for what she called the most important Easter service Mount Olive ever seen. At 63, Pearl had witnessed plenty of Easter mornings, but something about these 6 girls, their harmony, their hope, their absolute certainty that the world was opening up for them, made her believe this one would be different. Ruby Mae smoothed her choir robe and looked around at her friends. At 16, she was the eldest and felt responsible for the others. 13-year-old Violet Jones bounced on her toes, unable to contain her energy. Sisters Cora and Bessie Franklin, 15 and 14, whispered about the new dresses their mama had sewn for after service. 12-year-old Alma Porter clutched her hymnal like a lifeline, still nervous about her solo. And quiet Dorothy Washington, the preacher's own daughter at 14, hummed softly under her breath, lost in the music. "Remember what I told you all about staying together after service," Ruby Mae said, lowering her voice. She'd heard the talk around town, seen the way white folks looked at them when they walked to school in groups. Birmingham was changing, tensions, rising like heat from summer pavement, and her grandmother had warned her about being careful. "We always stay together," Dorothy said simply. Her father's calm confidence reflected in her voice. Through the basement windows, Ruby Mae could see cars pulling into the dirt parking lot, families arriving in their Easter finest. The morning artillery. Sun cast long shadows across the red Alabama clay, and somewhere upstairs, Reverend Washington was probably pacing behind the pulpit, preparing to deliver a sermon about resurrection and new beginnings. None of them knew it would be their last rehearsal. None of them could imagine that by sunset, their voices would be silenced forever, and their families would be left with nothing but unanswered questions and the haunting echo of hymns that would never be sung again. The Easter service had been everything Mrs. Pearl Jenkins promised it would be. The girls' voices soared through "Christ the Lord is risen today," their harmony so perfect that even the babies stopped crying to listen. Ruby Mae had felt the Spirit move through the congregation as they sang, watching grown men wipe tears from their eyes and women raise their hands toward heaven. But now, as the afternoon sun slanted low across the church parking lot, something was wrong. Where are they? Evelyn Williams paced between the cars, her Easter hat tilted sideways from running her hands through her hair. Ruby Mae said they'd be right back after they changed clothes. That was 2 hours ago. The other mothers clustered together near the church steps, their voices rising with each passing minute. The girls had disappeared somewhere between the end of morning service and the start of evening program, vanishing like smoke in the Alabama heat. "Maybe they went to get something to eat," offered Mrs. Franklin, though her voice carried no conviction. Her daughters Cora and Bessie never missed a meal, especially not on Easter Sunday. Reverend Washington emerged from the church, his face grave. Behind him, Mrs. Jenkins wrung her hands in her apron. "I've checked every room," he said quietly. "The basement, the sanctuary, even the storage closets, they're not here." A white patrol car pulled into the lot, gravel crunching under its tires. Officer Brady stepped out slowly, surveying the group of black families with barely concealed irritation. "Y'all called about some missing children?" "6 girls," Evelyn said, stepping forward. "They've been gone since noon. This isn't like them." Brady pulled out a small notepad, clicking his pen with deliberate slowness. "How old?" 12 to 16. He looked up, eyebrows raised. "Teenagers. Ma'am, kids that age don't go missing. They go wandering. Probably found themselves some boys to talk to." He snapped the notepad shut. "They'll turn up when they get hungry." The dismissal hung in the air like humidity, thick and suffocating. These weren't just any children who had vanished. They were good girls, church girls, the kind who asked permission before walking to the corner store. But Officer Brady was already heading back to his car, leaving 6 families to face the growing darkness alone. 3 weeks later, Detective Frank Morrison sat behind a desk that had seen better decades, staring at 6 thin folders that contained almost nothing. Each file held a single report, a brief description, and a photograph that some mother had pressed into his hands with trembling fingers. He'd been assigned the case not because anyone expected him to solve it, but because someone downtown decided it needed to look like they were trying. Detective Morrison? Reverend Washington stood in the doorway, his Sunday suit replaced by work clothes and exhaustion. "Any word on our girls?" Morrison glanced up, then back at the files. In 3 weeks, he'd conducted exactly 4 interviews, all of them perfunctory. The gas station attendant who thought he might have seen something, but couldn't be sure. The store clerk who insisted she would have remembered 6 black girls but didn't. The bus driver who swore no children had boarded his route that evening, each lead dissolving like sugar in rain. "I've followed up on every tip," Morrison said, though they both knew the tips had been few and far between. Sometimes young people just move on, head north looking for opportunities. Reverend Washington's jaw tightened. "Ruby Mae Williams had a scholarship to Alabama State. Dorothy is my daughter. She wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. These girls didn't just move on." The phone on Morrison's desk rang, cutting through the tension. He picked it up, listened for a moment, then hung up slowly. "That was Chief Hawkins. He's reassigning me to another case. Says this one's gone. Cold. Cold." The word came out strangled. "It's been 3 weeks." Morrison avoided his eyes. "Look, Reverend, between you and me, maybe it's better if the church handles this quietly. Sometimes when these things get too much attention, it stirs up trouble for everyone involved. You understand?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Reverend Washington understood perfectly. He understood that 6 black girls could disappear without a trace, and the world would barely notice. He understood that their family's grief was considered less important than keeping the peace. He understood that somewhere in Birmingham, people knew exactly what had happened to Ruby Mae, Dorothy, Violet, Cora, Bessie, and Alma, and that knowledge would be buried deeper than any grave. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "God help us all." 40 years later, Dr. Zara Williams pulled her rental car into the parking lot of the Atlanta Civil Rights Archive, the morning sun casting long shadows across the asphalt, just as it had on that Easter Sunday in 1961. She didn't know about the 6 girls yet, didn't know their names or their voices or the way they'd vanished like smoke in the Alabama heat. She was here for her dissertation, researching the untold stories of black churches during the civil rights movement, looking for the voices that had been overlooked by mainstream historians. At 32, Zara had built her academic career on finding the forgotten. Her grandmother had always told her that the most important stories were the ones nobody wanted to tell, the ones that made people uncomfortable, the ones that revealed how easily truth could be buried under bureaucracy and fear. The archive smelled like old paper and decades of silence. Margaret Henderson, the elderly archivist, led her through rows of filing cabinets and storage boxes, explaining the organizational system in a voice that suggested she'd given this tour many times before. "Most researchers focus on the major events," Margaret said, pulling out a box labeled Birmingham Churches 1960-1965. "But you'd be surprised what you find in the smaller collections. Church records, local newspaper clippings, things that didn't make it into the official histories." Zara lifted the lid and found herself staring at photographs of church choirs, youth groups, Easter services. Smiling faces frozen in time. There, hope and determination visible even in faded black and white. She flipped through the photos until one made her pause. 6 girls in white choir robes, standing in front of a church sign that read, Mount Olive Baptist Church. "This is beautiful," she said, holding up the photograph. "Do you know anything about this choir?" Margaret moved closer, adjusting her glasses. Her expression shifted, something flickering behind her eyes. "Mount Olive. Yes, I remember that name coming up before." "There was something—" She trailed off, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, my memory isn't what it used to be, but there should be more files in the Birmingham section." That afternoon, Zara sat alone in the research room, surrounded by boxes and manila folders. Most contained routine church bulletins, financial records, correspondence about fundraising events. But buried in a folder marked Miscellaneous Correspondence 1961, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a letter from Mount Olive Baptist Church to the Birmingham Police Department, dated May 15, 1961. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. "Please, we are still waiting for word about our missing girls. Their families need answers. Ruby Mae Williams, Dorothy Washington, Violet Jones, Cora Franklin, Bessie Franklin, Alma Porter. Easter Sunday. Please don't forget them." Zara stared at the letter until the words blurred. 6 names, 6 girls who had somehow vanished from history itself. The drive to Birmingham took 4 hours, but Zara's mind raced the entire way. She'd called ahead to Mount Olive Baptist Church, explaining her research to Reverend Thompson, the current pastor. He'd been hesitant at first. Something in his voice suggested he knew more than he was saying, but eventually agreed to meet with her. Mount Olive looked smaller than she'd expected, its red brick facade weathered by decades of Alabama summers. Reverend Thompson met her at the front door, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and careful words. Behind him stood Mrs. Davis, the church secretary, whose suspicious glance suggested she'd rather Zara had stayed in Atlanta. "Dr. Williams, I appreciate your interest in our history," Reverend Thompson said as he led her inside, "though I'm not sure how much help we can be. Most of our older records were damaged in a flood back in the 80s. But Zara had learned to read between the lines of institutional memory. "I'm particularly interested in the youth choir from 1961. I found a letter at the archives, the missing girls." Mrs. Davis's voice cut through the air like a blade. She was older than Reverend Thompson, old enough to remember. "That's what you're really here about, isn't it?" The Reverend shot her a warning look, but Mrs. Davis continued. 40 years people been asking questions about those girls. 40 years of being told to let sleeping dogs lie." They descended into the church basement, past Sunday school classrooms and storage closets. The air grew cooler and heavier with each step. Mrs. Davis moved with purpose, leading them to a corner where boxes sat stacked against cement walls, some labeled with years, others bearing no identification at all. "After Reverend Washington. Passed in 78, we cleaned out his office," she said, pulling dust covers off several containers. "Found things he'd kept locked away, things he never talked about." She gestured to an unmarked cardboard box, smaller than the others, sitting alone on a metal shelf. Zara approached it slowly, her historian's instincts warring with something deeper, a sense that opening this box would change everything. The cardboard was soft with age, the corners reinforced with yellowed tape. No label, no date, just 2 words written in faded blue ink across the top. "Lost Souls." Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, she found them. A white baptism dress, size small. A pair of patent leather shoes, still shining despite the years. A small hymnal with property of Mount Olive Youth Choir, stamped inside the front cover. A notebook filled with careful handwriting, song lyrics, practice schedules, notes about upcoming performances, and at the bottom, a photograph she recognized. 6 girls in white choir robes, the same image she'd seen at the archive, but this one was different. This one had names written on the back in the same careful handwriting. Ruby Mae, Dorothy, Violet, Cora, Bessie, Alma. Easter, 1961. Last practice before service. Mrs. Davis's voice was barely a whisper. Reverend Washington kept their things. Said someday, someone would come looking for the truth. Zara lifted the baptism dress, and something fell from its folds, a small piece of paper folded tight. She opened it carefully, reading the words that made her hands tremble. "If something happens to us, remember we were here. We mattered. We were loved." The Birmingham Public Library's newspaper morgue smelled like old ink and forgotten deadlines. Zara had spent 3 days here, scrolling through microfilm until her eyes burned, searching for any mention of the missing girls. What she found was worse than silence. It was deliberate erasure. The Birmingham News had run exactly 1 article about the disappearance, buried on page 6 of the April 16, 1961 edition, Local Church Reports Missing Youth. 3 paragraphs, no photographs, no follow-up stories, as if 6 children could vanish and the world would barely notice. "You won't find much more in the official papers." The voice belonged to an elderly man with silver hair and ink-stained, fingers who'd been watching her work. Walter Hayes retired from the Birmingham World. Black press-covered stories the white papers wouldn't touch. Zara looked up from the microfilm reader. You covered this case? Walter nodded slowly, settling into the chair beside her. I was 28, eager to make a name for myself. Thought this story would be my break. 6 girls from good families. Just gone? That was news. His expression darkened. Or it should have been. He pulled out a manila folder, yellowed with age. I wrote 3 articles about those girls, interviewed the families, talked to witnesses, even found a gas station attendant who remembered seeing them with some white men that evening. My editor killed every story. Zara's heart raced as she examined the unpublished articles. Walter's reporting was thorough, compassionate, urgent. He'd captured the family's anguish, the community's fear, the police department's indifference. Why would they suppress this? Because Birmingham in 1961 was a powder keg, Walter said quietly. Freedom riders were coming, sit-ins happening all over the South. Last thing the white establishment wanted was another story about black children being harmed. Bad for business, bad for the city's image. He pointed to a paragraph in one of his articles. See this witness account? Mary Catherine Jenkins saw the girls talking to 3 white men near the church parking lot around 6 that evening. When I went back to interview her a week later, she'd changed her story. Said she was mistaken, hadn't seen anything after all. Someone got to her. Someone got to everyone. Walter's voice carried 40 years of frustration. The gas station attendant suddenly couldn't remember anything. A church deacon who'd heard shouting that night decided he must have been confused. One by one, every witness I'd found developed amnesia. Zara stared at the photograph accompanying Walter's first article. The same 6 faces she'd seen in Reverend Washington's box. But here they looked alive, vibrant, full of dreams that would never be realized. What do you think really happened to them? Walter was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table. I think they saw something. They shouldn't have seen, or someone decided they were a threat that needed to be eliminated. And I think there were people in positions of power who made sure the truth stayed buried. He stood to leave, then turned back. Dr. Williams, if you're planning to dig into this, be careful. Some folks in this city have long memories, and they don't appreciate people stirring up old trouble. Alone in the morgue, Zara realized she was no longer just researching a dissertation. She was hunting for justice that had been denied for 40 years. The Pine Ridge nursing home in Tuscaloosa smelled like disinfectant and forgotten memories. Zara had tracked down Dorothy Mae Johnson through old church records, following a thread that led from Birmingham to this quiet facility where the past came to fade away. At 78, Dorothy Mae was one of the few people still alive who might remember Easter Sunday 1961. She sat in a wheelchair by the window, her hands folded, in her lap, staring out at a garden she probably couldn't see clearly anymore. When Zara approached, Dorothy Mae's cloudy eyes sharpened with something that might have been recognition or fear. You're here about those girls, she said, before Zara could introduce herself. Her voice was thin but steady. I've been expecting someone to come asking, though I figured it would be too late by now. Zara pulled up a chair, careful not to startle the elderly woman. Mrs. Johnson, I'm researching what happened to the Mount Olive choir girls. I understand you lived near the church in 1961. Dorothy Mae's hands began to shake. I was 28 then, had 2 little ones of my own. We lived in the house right behind the church, close enough to hear them practicing their songs. Her voice broke slightly. Such beautiful voices. Did you see anything that evening? Easter Sunday? For a long moment, Dorothy Mae said nothing. Then she closed her eyes, and 40 years of buried guilt came spilling out. I was hanging laundry on the back porch around 7 o'clock. Heard voices from the church parking lot, sounded like arguing. Looked over and saw those girls standing near a black sedan with 3 white men. Zara leaned forward, her heart racing. Can you describe what you saw? The men were dressed nice, like businessmen or something. One of them was doing the talking, real aggressive-like. The girls looked scared, huddled together like they did during practice. Ruby Mae, I knew her mama. She was trying to back away, but one of the men grabbed her arm. Dorothy Mae opened her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. I should have done something. Should have called out, run over there, called the police. But I was scared. A black woman interfering with white men in 1961. I had my own babies to think about. What happened next? They made the girls get in the car, all 6 of them, packed in like they were going on a church trip. But I could see their faces through the back window as they drove away. They weren't going anywhere they wanted to go. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Zara could feel the weight of 40 years of silence, the burden this woman had carried every day since that Easter evening. I called the church the next morning, Dorothy, May whispered. Told Reverend Washington what I saw. He said he'd handle it, talk to the police, but nothing happened. Days went by, then weeks. Finally, a detective came to see me, Frank Morrison. When I told him about the white men, he got real quiet, said there must be some mistake, that I was probably confused about what I saw. But you weren't confused. Dorothy May shook her head firmly. I know what I saw. Those girls were taken, and somebody made sure nobody would ever find out who did it. Detective Sarah Cruz had seen enough cold cases to recognize when a file had been deliberately sanitized. She spread the 6 thin folders across her desk in Birmingham Police Headquarters, each one containing barely 2 pages of documentation. For children who had vanished without a trace, the paperwork was suspiciously sparse. This is everything? Zara asked, leaning over the desk. She'd called Cruz that morning, armed with Dorothy May's testimony and Walter Hayes's suppressed articles. Everything that survived, Cruz said carefully. Her dark eyes held the same skepticism Zara had seen in other investigators who'd learned not to trust official records. Though survived might not be the right word. Cruz opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder marked Case Files. Disposed 1965. Inside were carbon copies of destruction orders, each one bearing the signature of Chief Harold Hawkins. Dozens of cases involving missing black children, unsolved assaults, suspicious deaths, all ordered destroyed after 4 years. Standard procedure was 7 years minimum retention, Cruz explained. But somehow, anything involving black victims from that era got expedited disposal. Chief Hawkins claimed it was a space issue. Zara felt her anger building like pressure in a sealed container. How convenient. Gets worse. Cruz pulled out another document, this one a memo dated May 1961. Internal communication from Detective Frank Morrison to Chief Hawkins. Morrison wrote that the Dorothy May Johnson witness interview contained unreliable testimony from a confused, colored woman, and recommended no further investigation. The memo continued in Morrison's typewritten words. Subject claims to have seen unidentified white males with missing juveniles, but given the reliability issues inherent in such witnesses and the potential for community unrest, suggest case be handled through appropriate church channels. Appropriate church channels, Zara repeated, her voice tight with rage. Translation, make it disappear quietly. Cruz turned to another file. But Morrison wasn't acting alone. Look at this. She showed Zara a series of reports from other officers, all dated within days of each other in April and May 1961. Each one described interviews with potential witnesses, the gas station attendant, church members, neighbors, and each one concluded that the witness had reconsidered their initial statement, or realized they were mistaken. 7 witnesses, all changing their stories within a 2-week period. Cruz shook her head. That doesn't happen by accident. Zara studied the signatures on the reports. The same officers kept interviewing the witnesses. A coordinated effort to silence anyone who might have information. Cruz leaned back in her chair. Dr. Williams, I've been working cold cases for 12 years. I've seen institutional incompetence. I've seen evidence lost to time and bureaucracy. But this? She gestured to the files. This was deliberate obstruction. Through the window, Birmingham stretched out under an overcast sky. The same city where 6 girls had been swallowed by darkness 40 years ago. Somewhere in those streets, people were still alive who knew exactly what had happened that Easter Sunday. People who had spent 4 decades believing their secret was buried as deep as the truth itself. What's our next move? Zara asked. Cruz closed the files with a finality that suggested she'd already made her decision. We find out where they took those girls, and we make sure everyone responsible faces what they've been running from all these years. The abandoned construction site sat like a wound in the earth, 20 miles outside Birmingham, where the city gave way to scrub pine and red clay. Dorothy May's directions had been precise despite the decades, past the old steel mill, where they were building that shopping center that never got finished. Big hole in the ground surrounded by concrete barriers. Zara stood at the edge of what had once been an excavation site, now overgrown with kudzu and forgotten dreams. In 1961, this had been the future, a modern shopping complex that would bring progress to the outskirts of Birmingham. The project had died the same year as the Choir Girls, abandoned when funding mysteriously dried up. Detective Cruz emerged from her car, followed by Dr. Marcus Webb from the University of Alabama's Forensic Archaeology program. Webb had brought ground-penetrating radar equipment and a team of graduate students who worked with the quiet efficiency of people who understood they were searching for more than artifacts. Dorothy May said they drove past the construction site and turned down a dirt road, Zara explained, consulting her notebook. She watched from her kitchen window as the car headed toward the old quarry. The quarry had been filled in decades ago, transformed into what now looked like a natural depression in the landscape. But Webb's equipment revealed the truth beneath. The surface, irregular soil density, areas where the earth had been disturbed and hastily covered. "Here," Webb called out, his voice cutting through the humid afternoon air. "Multiple anomalies in this section. Looks like several small excavations, maybe 4 to 6 feet deep." Zara felt her legs weaken. After 40 years of questions, they were finally approaching answers she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. The weight of 6 families' grief settled on her shoulders like a mantle she couldn't remove. Cruz stood beside her, watching the forensic team mark the areas with small orange flags. "You know what we're going to find here, don't you?" "I've known since I found that note in the baptism." "Dress," Zara whispered. "They didn't run away, they didn't get lost. They were murdered and buried in unmarked graves, while their families were told to grieve quietly. The first excavation began at dawn the next morning." Webb's team worked with archaeological precision, photographing each layer of soil, cataloguing every fragment they uncovered. The earth gave up its secrets slowly. Scraps of fabric, small personal items, the detritus of lives cut short. Then, 6 feet down in the red Alabama clay, they found her. A small skeleton curled on its side as if sleeping. Beside the remains lay a tarnished piece of jewelry, a small cross on a delicate chain, the kind young girls wore to church on Easter Sunday. Webb looked up from the excavation, his face grave. "Dr. Williams, Detective Cruz, I think you should see this." Zara approached the edge of the grave, her hands trembling. 40 years of silence were about to end, and the truth was exactly as terrible as she'd feared. But these girls deserved to be found, deserved to have their names spoken aloud again, deserved justice that had been denied for far too long. The earth had kept their secret. Now it was time for the living to face what had been buried in darkness. By the 3rd day they had found all 6. The graves were shallow, hastily dug, scattered across the old quarry site like terrible seeds that had finally sprouted truth. Each excavation revealed what the families had known in their hearts for 40 years. Their daughters hadn't run away, hadn't started new lives in distant cities, hadn't simply vanished into the night. They had been murdered and buried in unmarked graves, while the world moved on without them. Evelyn Williams knelt beside the grave that held her daughter, Ruby May, her aged hands clutching the small patent leather shoe the forensic team had carefully extracted from the red clay. At 79, she was the only parent still alive to witness this moment. The others, Dorothy Washington's father, Violet's mother, the Franklin sisters' parents, had died without ever knowing what became of their children. "She was wearing these to church that morning," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. "Saved. Up 3 months to buy them. Said she wanted to look perfect for Easter service." Zara stood with the other family members who had gathered, grandchildren and cousins and siblings who had grown old, carrying questions that finally had answers. The silence around the excavation site was different from the silence that had shrouded this case for decades. This was the silence of recognition, of grief finally allowed to surface, of truth that could no longer be denied. Dr. Webb approached with evidence bags containing the personal effects they'd recovered, a small hymnal with property of Mount Olive Youth Choir still legible on the cover, fragments of white fabric from choir robes, a broken chain that had once held a cross around Alma Porter's neck. Each item was a life interrupted, a dream destroyed, a family's hope buried in Alabama clay. The positioning suggests they were killed elsewhere and brought here, Webb said quietly to Detective Cruz, based on the condition of the remains and the artifacts. They were buried within hours of the disappearance. Cruz nodded grimly. Easter Sunday night, while their families were searching the streets, calling their names, praying they'd come home. Violet Jones's nephew, a man in his 50s who'd never stopped wondering about the aunt he'd never met, held up a photograph from that final Easter morning. The 6 girls stood together in their white robes, arms linked, smiling at a future they would never see. They looked so happy, he said, so sure that the world was full of possibilities. As the forensic team continued their careful work, documenting every detail that would be needed for the official report, Zara felt the weight of 40 years settling around her. She thought about Reverend Washington, who had died clutching their memory, about Dorothy Mae Johnson, who had carried the burden of witnessing their fate, about Walter Hayes, who had tried to tell their story when it still might have mattered. But most of all, she thought about 6 girls who had trusted that the world would protect them, who had believed that their voices mattered, who had written that final note, hoping someone would remember they were here. The earth had finally spoken. Now it was time for justice to find its voice. The Birmingham courthouse steps overflowed with reporters, cameras and faces that carried 40 years of questions finally approaching answers. Zara stood at the podium, the forensic report in her hands, feeling the weight of 6 families' trust and a community's long-suppressed grief. On Easter Sunday, 1961, 6 young women vanished from Mount Olive Baptist Church, she began, her voice carrying across the crowd. Ruby Mae Williams, 16, Dorothy Washington, 14, Violet Jones, 13, Cora Franklin, 15, Bessie Franklin, 14, Alma Porter, 12. Each name rang out like a bell, echoing off the courthouse walls where justice had been denied for 4 decades. In the crowd, Evelyn Williams dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, finally hearing her daughter's name spoken with the dignity it's deserved. For 40 years, their families were told these girls had run away, that they were troubled children who had brought their fate upon themselves. The truth is that they were abducted and murdered, and evidence of that crime was systematically destroyed by members of the Birmingham Police Department. A murmur rippled through the gathered reporters. Detective Cruz stepped forward, holding up the files that documented the cover-up. We have recovered internal memos showing that witness testimony was suppressed, evidence was destroyed ahead of schedule, and investigating officers were ordered to close the case without proper investigation. The questions came like rain after a drought. Had anyone been arrested? Were suspects still alive? Would charges be filed? Cruz fielded them with professional calm, but Zara could see the frustration in her eyes. Most of the perpetrators were likely dead, and those who remained would be protected by statutes of limitations and the passage of time. But the press conference wasn't about arrests. It was about acknowledgement. That evening, Mount Olive Baptist Church opened its doors for a memorial service that should have happened 40 years earlier. The sanctuary was packed, pews filled with 3 generations who had grown up in the shadow of this tragedy. Reverend Thompson stood at the pulpit where Reverend Washington had once struggled to comfort families who would never see their children again. Tonight we speak their names, he said, his voice carrying the weight of communal pain, not as victims, but as the young women they were, daughters who loved their families, students who had dreams, singers whose voices brought joy to this sanctuary. One by one, family members came forward to share memories. Evelyn Williams spoke of Ruby Mae's determination to attend college. A cousin remembered Violet's infectious laugh. Dorothy Washington's, a younger brother, now in his 50s, recalled how she used to practice her solo parts while helping with household chores. In the back pew, Walter Hayes sat with tears streaming down his face. The story he'd tried to tell in 1961 was finally being heard, though justice remained as elusive as it had been 4 decades ago. As the service ended, Zara realized that sometimes the victory isn't in the courtroom. Sometimes it's in the speaking of names, the telling of truth, the refusal to let love be buried with the dead. The girls were still gone, but they were no longer forgotten. Outside, Birmingham slept under the same stars that had witnessed their disappearance, but the silence that had protected their killers was finally broken. Easter Sunday, 2002, 41 years to the day after 6 girls had sung their final hymn. The memorial garden behind Mount Olive Baptist Church bloomed with white azaleas and dogwood trees, their branches heavy with the promise of spring. 6 granite stones formed a semicircle around a central fountain, each one bearing a name, a photograph, and the words, "Their voices echo still." The garden had been built with donations from across the country, funded by people who had heard the story and refused to let it be forgotten again. Zara stood beside the fountain as families gathered for the dedication ceremony. Evelyn Williams, now 80, sat in a wheelchair near Ruby May's memorial stone, her great-granddaughter holding her hand. 3 generations connected by loss and love, by the refusal to let time erase truth. The current Mount Olive Youth Choir, 12 voices strong, took their places where the original choir had once rehearsed. They were teenagers like Ruby May and Dorothy and Violet had been, full of dreams and certainty that the world would make space for their aspirations. But unlike their predecessors, these young people knew their history. They understood what had been lost and what they carried forward. "Today we remember not just 6 young women who were taken from us," Reverend Thompson said, his voice carrying across the memorial garden. "We remember the power of truth to survive, even when institutions fail, when evidence is destroyed, when witnesses are silenced. We remember that love is stronger than fear, and that speaking someone's name is an act of resurrection." Detective crews had driven up from Birmingham for the ceremony. In the months since the excavation, she had established the Missing and Murdered Children Task Force, dedicated to reopening cold cases involving black children whose disappearances had been inadequately investigated. It was a small step toward justice, but it was movement in the right direction. As the choir began to sing "His Eye is on the Sparrow," the same hymn that had echoed through the church basement on that final Easter morning in 1961, Zara closed her eyes and listened. The melody was the same, but the voices were different, stronger, more aware of their power, less willing to be silenced. When the song ended, Zara stepped forward to read the final words inscribed on the memorial's central stone. "In memory of Ruby May Williams, Dorothy Washington, Violet Jones, Cora Franklin, Bessie Franklin, and Alma Porter." Their voices were silenced, but their song continues. May we never forget. May we never stop listening. The sun climbed higher over Birmingham, casting long shadows across the memorial garden. Somewhere in the city, people who had kept silent for 41 years might finally be sleeping uneasy in their beds. The girls were at rest now, their names carved in stone, their story told at last. But their voices, those would echo forever, a reminder that some truths are too powerful to bury, and some loves too strong to kill. In the garden, where white flowers bloomed like choir robes in the Alabama sun, 6 girls would sing eternal Easter songs, and the world would finally listen.